How's everybody doing today? You know, I've been trying to tell people, just leave the DCEU alone, but no. So I have to deal with this guy named Brown Table. He did a breakdown of the Justice League film, in which again, he had to be negative about it without understanding. Now this guy, he has a little bit of intellect on films. He's got a little intelligence, but again, like most guys out there is not that broad understanding of things. And so this guy, his video is why no DCU film will ever top The Dark Knight, which is the dumbest thing, the dumbest title ever, because you can't tell the future. And his name is Brown Table. I'm guessing this is his opinion. And what's so funny to me about this guy is that his whole lens for seeing movies is based through the lens of The Dark Knight. And that's when you have a limited view of movies. So I'm not going to play his video, but I will go through bit by bit in his video on the points he addressed. So the first thing he does is he says at the age of 8 or 10 or whenever he was, he saw The Dark Knight. He said Spider-Man 2 was a film that affected him when he was 5. It is what it is. But he said he thought that The Dark Knight was the first superhero film that crossed genres because it wasn't treated as a superhero film, but treat the characters like everyday, normal characters in life. Even though there was some superhero stuff in it, it was more of a realistic film drama, like a crime drama or whatever. So he was totally, it impacted him greatly, The Dark Knight. And he thought it was a drama, a thriller, a horror film. I don't know how he gets horror film because I don't really get the horror elements. I do get the drama. I do get the thriller elements, but I don't consider it a horror film. Okay, but that's what he says. Horror films scare you. The Joker doesn't. He's very dramatic, yes, but you don't get that horror element. He's very graphic. He's brutal, but he's not a horror element. Horror elements mean you are scared, and he has to scare you, and his whole goal is to scare you. So I don't see any horror elements in the Joker. The Joker's not trying to scare people. He's trying to make a point, yes, but he's not trying to scare people. Anyway, the guy's name is Brown Table. That should tell you everything. He's an Asian dude, and he goes into how he really loves The Dark Knight. Now, he then goes on to construct a number of arguments which are intellectually dishonest concerning other movies and what they should be. But before I even go into that, let me just make this point that The Dark Knight is not the first superhero movie to treat superheroes as if we're in a drama. Just for this guy to know, and you can send this to his video if you want, there is the movie Unbreakable. And Unbreakable was a superhero movie with Mr. Glass and the other guy whose bones couldn't be broken. So he should probably pay that film a visit. That was in 2000. Now, when we look at The Dark Knight, this is what his video had to say. His video said, first of all, that Christopher Nolan, what he was able to do was take the story of The Dark Knight, and he was able to work the characters, the plot, and give everything focus. So he said that Christopher Nolan was good at focusing the film. Well, once again, I don't think of The Dark Knight as a bad film, any way, shape, or form. I thought it was a very good, solid film. Some people call it a masterpiece of filmmaking. I would say it was a very focused film. I thought that what he said there was bang on. However, he went on to criticize other films that didn't approach the storytelling the way that Christopher Nolan approached The Dark Knight, and say, therefore, that they were not as good as The Dark Knight. And that's where he went wrong, and I'll show you what I mean. So one of the first things he started talking about was the relationship between the antagonist and the protagonist of the film. Now, as we all know, the Joker is always the protagonist of Batman. Antagonist of Batman, okay? Batman and the Joker, they work hand in hand. You go and watch Batman 1989, the Joker and Batman. And he felt that this clash between these two characters was great because it carried the film, and not only that, but he said it established the tension of the film. Now, I have no problem with what he said there. My problem is when he tries to superimpose that on other movies with other stories which do not speak about that kind of relationship. And so he goes on to speak about Ant-Man. And he talks about the clash between Ant-Man and the main antagonist of the movie finally happens in the third act. And that there's exposition to describe the antagonist. But all through the movie, if you were paying attention, the antagonist is trying to find a solution to a problem, and he's trying to find Ant-Man. He's trying to get his hands on Ant-Man. So he has to understand, this guy, he thinks that you only have to have direct conflict, and there must be dialogue between the protagonist and the antagonist. No, it doesn't have to be that way. And just to make that point, The Dark Knight Rises actually works like that. There is a direct conflict between Bane and Batman, yes. But there's also Talia al Ghul, who is playing in the background, and she is sort of the puppeteer. So you can't, all movies don't work one formulaic way. And these people, they go to film school, or they've been influenced by the critics of today, and they believe movies must only have a particular format to work. Ant-Man works because the antagonist doesn't know who the protagonist is, and then finally gets to know who the protagonist is in the final showdown. So you have to be able to understand this. And I think a story can be told many different ways, but more importantly, you have to know what is the story you're telling, and therefore the characters play into that story. Let's move on. So he goes on to talk about the fact that in Man of Steel, now he's talking about story arcs. So he goes on to say that, for instance, Man of Steel, the story arc of Man of Steel, it begins with Kal-El being the last son of Krypton, and it ends with Kal-El being the last son of Krypton. And he says it's an erroneous statement for people to say that Kal-El became the last son of Krypton at the end of Man of Steel. Now, his major problem, why he doesn't understand that actually Kal-El begins as the last son of Krypton, does not begin, as the last son of Krypton, is because he does not understand that Man of Steel has flashbacks, dream sequences, exposition that helps us to understand what really happened after Krypton exploded. See, he's going by what Jor-El said, that Superman is the last hope for Krypton. But you can't go by what Jor-El says. You have to watch at what General Zod says to Kal-El in the dream sequence, where General Zod says when Krypton exploded, they were released from the Phantom Zone, which means Superman was not the last son of Krypton. Furthermore, if you look at the story as it unfolds, when General Zod comes to Earth, he says, "You are not alone." And then he talks about one of his citizens. So therefore, his argument that Superman began as the last son of Krypton is not true. And in the end of the movie, Superman then becomes the last son of Krypton because he kills the last Kryptonian that's on Earth. At least he thinks so, at least. And so he's alone. And the whole story arc of Superman, to start with, does not begin that way. Superman doesn't know what his identity is. He learns who he is. He learns who his purpose is. And finally, he starts to grow into accomplishing his purposes. He began in the dark. He comes out into the light. There's sacrifices for him to stay in the dark until he's ready to come out into the light. And so this is a progression of Superman gradually becoming that Superman we expect him to be. So that is a huge story arc, a tremendous story arc, much more than the Dark Knight, actually. But because he's so simplistic in the way how he looks at story arcs, and he believes they must be defined a specific way, he cannot understand that Superman has gone through a long journey by the time he reaches the end of Man of Steel. Why I'm talking about story arcs is because he pits this against the Dark Knight. which he thinks is his perfect movie, in which Batman begins with his love interest, which is, I forgot what her name is. You guys know what her name is from Batman Begins. And his love interest, she's someone he hopes to be with, or he's comfortable with her being with Harvey Dent, but she's alive. And he erroneously says this, which I think in his video he misses the point. That is, he says that the Joker kills her and therefore takes away the option that Batman has of saving her life. But actually, Batman makes the choice. Batman has the choice, and he chooses to save Harvey Dent instead of the former ex-girlfriend he had. So he had to make a choice. The Joker made him make a choice. And the Joker wanted to know who Batman would choose. And he chose Harvey Dent to save instead of the woman. Okay? In so doing, this is where the Joker was successful. He was able to change Harvey Dent, turn him. Batman and company wanted to retire from being Batman. Batman was trying to protect Harvey Dent, preserve him so that he would be the beacon of light to Gotham. And instead, the Joker was able to influence Harvey Dent into changing his mind, to which Batman had to kill Harvey Dent. Okay? The one thing Batman didn't want to do. He does not like killing, even though he's killed a lot in Batman Begins and so on. But that's not his thing. He doesn't want to kill people. And so Batman ends up killing Harvey Dent, and so the Joker's happy about that. Okay? So the Joker got Batman to do two things that he generally stresses on he does not like doing, even though he does do them. So Harvey Dent was the beacon of hope, turns out to be corrupted. But Batman and Commissioner Gordon, they tried to preserve that by putting out this lie that Batman was the one that did these things and blew up the place and so on. Okay? So that's where the Joker is able to influence Batman. But that's not the first time the Joker has done that, actually. He's done it in the comics. He's done it... well, we have not actually seen an on-screen performance of the Joker doing that. Even in Batman 1989, though there was a relationship between Joker and himself, and even Bruce Wayne and the Joker, the Joker doesn't get Batman to do something against his will. So this is the first time we see Batman doing something against his will, and the Joker succeeding in manipulating him. But at the same time, the point is, he is arguing that Batman's story arc has changed, and the character is changed by the antagonist, and therefore that makes the arc of Batman turn. Whereas he's saying that in Man of Steel there's no arc turn. With Man of Steel, it doesn't need a protagonist for his arc to change, and then when the antagonist finally comes up in the end to deal with him, Man of Steel, Superman has to make a choice. So Batman made a choice between his girlfriend and the beacon of hope, which was Harvey Dent. Superman had a bigger choice to make, and he's been prepared to make this choice throughout his life. And finally, he was prepped by his Kryptonian father, who wanted him to also make this choice, which was to choose between mankind, humanity, or his own people. So, again, this is just a lack of understanding by this guy. He thinks that there's not much of a story arc with Superman, but there's a great story arc here because the antagonist was able to force the protagonist against his will to do something against his will. Where one ended in tragedy, the other end in hope, even though there's still tragedy in there. So I don't think this guy appreciates storytelling. He thinks storytelling must be only in the lens of a direct antagonism, and if the antagonist succeeds in changing the protagonist's mind, then that's good. No, it's not necessarily. It doesn't have to be that case, and story arcs don't always have to work that way. And that doesn't mean that it is not a great story arc. And Man of Steel had a great story arc, and I think this guy, his problem is, The Dark Knight has a good story arc, okay, but his problem is trying to superimpose that story arc on every single other comic book movie. That's dumb, and that's where he's falling short. Okay. Now he goes on to argue that The Dark Knight, every character's arc ends. Now if he's really smart and if he's really paying attention, Alfred's character arc does not end in The Dark Knight. Alfred's character arc ends in The Dark Knight Rises. That's all I got to say about that. So he's wrong about that point. But here's something else. He tries to pit that against Oh, he goes on to say the Marvel films, they do a better job of closing off their character arc ends for their movies. But not really. What happened with Vision and Scarlet Witch? Are their character arcs closed? No, they're open-ended. Right? Vision shot Rhodey, and Scarlet Witch was put in prison. And she's afraid to be put in prison. She said this over and over and over again. So we need to know the consequences of that. The principals, some of their character arcs are finished, but not all of them. Captain America, he was able to put Bucky in a safe place. So Bucky and his character arcs are somewhat satisfied at the end of the movie. They're not complete, but they're satisfied. Iron Man, he's still there with the Accords. And the Accords split up the Avengers, right? Not really, but kind of. So he's still there with the Accords. He's still conflicted. He began not being conflicted, thinking this is the way to go, but as usual, impulsive Iron Man, he's left reflecting on things. His story arc is unfinished and open-ended. So he's not really giving the correct information. Yes, there are other Marvel films where the arcs are pretty much closed off. They try to tie off the ends. But if you're really paying attention to story arcs, you would know that in Suicide Squad, a lot of character story arcs are closed. One character story arc is open. And that character story arc is Harley Quinn. The Joker comes at the end and takes her. And that's okay. You don't have to tie off a story arc in a story for it to be good. And it's not that it's not a standalone. It's a standalone. It's just that you don't have to. Further, he goes on to talk about all of these films having Easter eggs. So he talks about Batman v Superman. Again, these guys keep on picking on the DCEU, which is doing something different. And he talks about it has a lot of Easter eggs. And he talks about how Wonder Woman, what did he say? He says some of the Easter eggs point to other movies. Like you have these little demos in there. By the way, Spider-Man's story arc also was open-ended. I just forgot. But he was a cameo. But he talks about all these open-ended movies these days. And he's really jabbing at the DCEU. This guy, of course, is probably a Nolanite. He will defend Marvel, but he will bash DC. So he goes on to say how these films are riddled with Easter eggs. Modern films these days. He's talking about the DCU, by the way. And he then goes on to say how these films, they are always open-ended and leaving you waiting for something else to happen. And he's talking probably about the dust rising off of Superman's grave at the end of BVS. Now, again, you have different ways of approaching filmmaking. Pretty much the story is tied together. Diana helps save the world. She's there with Bruce Wayne, mourning Superman's death. She goes her way. Bruce Wayne goes his way. Lex Luthor's in prison. Pretty much like Civil War, certain threads are tied up and certain threads are open-ended. What has happened to Doomsday? Who knows, right? And so that's how movies are done. Now he's saying The Dark Knight didn't have that. But it's not true. Because you have to remember Alfred had a wish, and his wish is still open-ended, and he expressed it quite a lot. And he was hoping that Bruce Wayne would be able to give up the Batman so that Bruce Wayne could go on with a normal life. And he only saw that actualization in The Dark Knight Rises. So for him to say again that The Dark Knight closed up all loose ends, and that most of the Marvel movies, including Captain America Civil War, close up all, is to be intellectually dishonest. Let's move on. He goes on to talk about the travesty of Suicide Squad, how the characters and the plot of the film were two separate things. This is not true at all. This is very false. And he goes on to say how The Dark Knight, all the characters serve the plot of the film. Now, of course, in The Dark Knight, the characters did serve the plot of the film for the most part. There are certain places where it didn't. But the point is, when you look at Suicide Squad, which is a totally different kind of movie, it's about villains and it's about bad versus evil, you will know, once again, that Suicide Squad is giving you a backstory for these characters, which serves for their motivation as to why they do what they do in the movie. For instance, Harley Quinn's, her motivation and the whole backstory is to show her relationship with the Joker and her motivation while she's with the Suicide Squad. Eventually, and throughout the movie, up to the end when she's making a deal with Enchantress, it's about bringing back the Joker to life. When you look at Deadshot, you see what his motivation is throughout the movie, and similarly. So the backstories to the characters, which we all see in the introduction to the characters, is valid to the plot of the movie. And the plot of the movie, yet lest somebody says it's nonsensical, it's simple, but it's not nonsensical, is the point of these characters coming together to save the world. That is the plot. It is specific to the mayhem that happens in Midway City. All right? And the whole reason to have the Suicide Squad was this stand-up backup that was in response to the death of Superman for any challenges or problems that happen. Basically, Justice League is the same thing, except it was an accumulation of villains brought together against their will. So, though the storyline was rather simple, just like Justice League, for the most part, you see the motivation of these characters. That's why the backstory was necessary, and it's important. The characters are what drive the story, so the plot is driven by the characters. And what makes the plot have some kind of gravitas or depth is the depth of the characters and their growth. So once again, this guy misses the whole point of storytelling, and that, no, you cannot cram these movies into the same sort of formula that Christopher Nolan used for The Dark Knight. That's just your problem. And it's because you're a Nolanite. All you can see is you're impressed by The Dark Knight. And then he goes on to show inconsistency of characters. And he says it's ridiculous. And his ridiculousness, he says it's ridiculous because this is what unfolds. With Deadshot and his relationship with his daughter, hold on a second. His daughter pleads with him when Enchantress, pleads with him not to shoot the gun to blow up the bomb that will destroy a machine that's going to take over the world that Enchantress is doing. Okay? And he pits that and shows it's ridiculous because the same daughter pleaded with him not to shoot Batman. In one case, he shot Batman, and then it seems as though he's inconsistent in shooting the bomb. The difference between that was established when Enchantress throws a spell on them and tells them, I know what you want. And it precedes that it's an illusion that they're getting what they want, which is with Deadshot was killing Batman. So one is actually an illusion and the other one is genuine. And bearing that in mind, therefore, this one, Deadshot is able to realize, is an illusion, a very strong illusion, but not just an illusion, because the request is to stop a machine from destroying the world, and he's realizing that. Also, when you look at his gun, it slips between hate and love, and it centers on love, which means for the love of the world, Deadshot chooses to shoot the shot. And it contrasts, which is what is called symmetry, with the moment when Deadshot does not shoot Batman because of his love for his daughter. So one is the love for his daughter, which is genuine because it's his real daughter. It's not an illusion. And the second one is an illusion, and Deadshot is able to distinguish between the illusion that Enchantress is doing and the actual reality of the love for his daughter. He realizes that Enchantress is trying to manipulate him. And so the difference there allows Deadshot to actually see his daughter in the end. Again, this guy cannot discriminate between these subtle points of storytelling. And so when I see somebody like this trying to talk about other movies and how no DCEU film can ever top The Dark Knight, and he comes with these really, I think, intellectually dishonest points, it's rather funny to me to see these kinds of people getting these kinds of views. Because they're all about bashing the DCEU. At the end of the day, these people are going to say, why the DCEU is not better. And then when we come 10, 15 years from now, people will be wondering, what the hell were these people thinking? Because they won't remember the MCU movies. They won't last that long. And they won't remember The Dark Knight. People will be like, why this movie was so great? Why did they say this movie was so great? I love these DCU movies. They're fantastic. And they tell all these things. They really show how people progressed from a long way. That's what will happen. But anyway, let's just keep it moving. So, here we have The Dark Knight again. And the last point that this guy makes here is that the last point he makes, because he does make a last point. This is therefore he's showing now here in The Dark Knight from the point that he was making with Suicide Squad, that the plot and the story fits the characters. And his whole thing is that the Joker's driving the story, and we see the conflict between Batman and the Joker, how the Joker gets the Batman to do certain things. And so he thinks that, therefore, is what drives the story, and that the characters fit with the plot. But again, as I said before, limited knowledge on storytelling and understanding storytelling. The other thing I think this guy does not seem to understand is that superhero movies don't have to be linear in their plot, and they don't have to be what we call balletic plot. And he has a fundamental problem with stories where they're not linear, or they're interwoven plot, and they have dream sequences, and they have flashbacks. He seems to have a problem following movies like that. He needs simple movies with simple story. So I don't think he would follow Unbreakable that much, because Unbreakable also has flashbacks. And it's strange how these people, once you remove the genre of superhero movie or comic book movie, they can follow a plot in a TV series where you're going from one character to the next, and it's interwoven, and multiple things are happening at the same time. Take, for instance, CSI. CSI has multiple different things happening at the same time. We go from one character to the next character, to one character to the next, interwoven plot. We even get flashbacks. Yes, they cue the flashbacks, but they give you flashbacks. And it's strange how people can understand that, because it's a detective drama where you have to figure out things. That's what makes it a thriller. And BVS has that. And Justice League has it less. It's much more linear, as Wonder Woman. But Suicide Squad had that. And Man of Steel had some of it. And the thing about it is, because these movies do that, they're called interwoven movies, and they even change venue and people, and they don't always stay with one main protagonist all the time, because the story is being pieced together. And again, just so people know, BVS had thriller aspects to it. We didn't know who was behind the scenes pulling the strings until we realized it was Lex Luthor later on in the movie. We also had horror aspects to it, where Batman was scared stiff by the bat that came out of the tomb. Right? Very horrific moments. In Man of Steel, Superman getting his new powers and seeing things, it was very horrific for him, and we felt that horror. In Justice League, we had the horrific elements of the parademons slamming against the glass window and stuff like that. So you have different elements in movies. Wonder Woman didn't have so much horrific elements, except for the horror of war. But the point being, you have different elements in the movie. And I think a lot of people do not understand that Zack Snyder put all kinds of different elements. Drama, he put thriller, he put sort of a film noir atmosphere. He also put adventure. He put all of these things, action, sci-fi, right? He put all these things together in a comic book movie. BVS is one of the most incredible films you'll ever have, because why people come out the movie saying, I don't know what to make of this film, or some people say, I don't know what this film, what was this film trying to say? Well, obviously it was saying quite a lot, and in the crux of it, it means hope and humanity. Hope can be restored to someone who is hopeless, and that in the end, being a hero is not always something where you get thanks. But that's not the point. The point is, at the end of the day, BVS was a movie rich with so many genres incorporated into it that you couldn't isolate it down to just a superhero movie. It went beyond that. And it's strange that this guy praises The Dark Knight for being a movie outside the genre, but yet he cannot see outside the genre to look at Batman v Superman. He cannot see outside the genre to see what happened with Suicide Squad. And I say these things because narrow-mindedness of how you think a movie should be, this is the problem we have out here, leads to these clueless people, ignorant people, talking about movies that are much greater than they think, and will stand the test of time. There will be fantastic masterpieces looked back on by filmmakers and by a lot of people as before their time. And his limited knowledge about superhero movies, he doesn't even know about Unbreakable, tells me that this guy is speaking out of ignorance. He has a love for a certain movie, and he thinks all movies should be like that movie. And that's a problem a lot of people have. And it's a problem we have to deal with on a continual basis. We have people who loved BVS thinking that Justice League was going to be a BVS. It was going to be solemn. They even take music out of context and throw it into Justice League to show their love. When people do not understand what movies are saying, when they don't understand what they saw, they talk like this. And I've shown you guys here, without a shadow of a doubt, how much Justice League had in it. And not only that, but how it fills out the DCEU, fills out the trilogies, how it even sort of sets up what is coming next. And that's not even a full Zack Snyder vision, but it's all good. And my point being this. All you guys trying to condemn the DCU, not understanding the stuff that you see, I'm telling you, why don't you ask questions about it instead? And just zip that mouth. Because the more you talk is the more you look stupid. This Nolanite guy here, who's Brown Table of all tables. Why you have to call yourself Brown Table, bro? But anyway, this guy talks out of his ignorance. And he's not even that old. Look at this guy. He's a young little guy. He's a youngster. He's a youngster, an Asian youngster with limited understanding of film and limited understanding of movies. Every movie is an organism. Every movie comes from imagination. Blade Runner 2049 is a fantastic movie. Fantastic movie. Okay? And so when you think about movies, you have to understand what you're seeing. First of all, because his comparisons are horrible. He misunderstood the comparisons, and he's trying to put down a movie based on a movie he likes. You don't do that. You have to watch it, each story, and evaluate each story and what it's telling you. He doesn't even get Suicide Squad. If I asked him, well, what was the point of Suicide Squad? What was Suicide Squad trying to tell you? Could you tell me in a sentence? And that's why I said story is very important. These are the kinds of people that are putting up their videos on YouTube and in social media, clueless about the movies they're about to talk about and bad talk. This is a guy bashing the DCEU. He doesn't even understand what he saw. So what I tell him is, there's no problem. You can love The Dark Knight. But when it comes to DCU, ask questions first or shut the hell up. Because you don't know what you're talking. You're talking from a biased perspective of a limited knowledge of film. On that note, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I may have more videos on people who are anti-DCEU. This guy is obviously a Nolanite, and he doesn't even realize it. He's in love with Christopher Nolan's films. I'm not knocking him for being in love with them. But you got to understand, every film doesn't have to be approached like how Christopher Nolan approaches his films to be brilliant. You must be able to understand that and open your mind to those things. And just because people say that Batman v Superman was the worst film in comic book history doesn't mean, my friend, that it's so. Yes, so many times people in contemporary time call certain films. Alfred Hitchcock's film was considered a travesty of filmmaking. It's now a legendary masterpiece. And so will happen with Batman v Superman. I'm not too sure about Justice League, but Batman v Superman, definitely. Depending on if we get Snyder's cut of Justice League, it may be considered one of the greatest masterpieces ever and may be looked upon again by filmmakers. Because Zack Snyder, a visionary director, did something that directors never do. He crossed genres. He did a very eclectic movie. So tell Brown Tabor for me, if you can. Put it up on this video. Let him know that if you don't understand something that's too big for your little mind, leave it alone. You guys have a great one.